Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a video on wireless networking. In this video, we're going to take a look at some of the benefits of using wireless networking. Then we're going to go ahead and take a look at the components of a wireless access point. Now, we learned in a previous video that a wireless access point is a network device that allows wireless users to connect into your wired network. So we'll take a look at the components that make that device up. Then we'll go ahead and talk about how to decide where to place your wireless access point. We'll go over some of the wireless networking standards that we have out there today. Then we're going to take a look at how to secure your wireless network. And this is pretty important to a lot of people because there's this big fear out there that if data is traveling through the airwaves, and you can't really restrict the airways, or at least not as easily as you can restrict access to a physical cable, well, how do we keep it safe? So we'll take a look at some of our options there. And then we'll go in and I'll actually show you how to set up a wireless access point. So first of all, what are some of the benefits of wireless networking? Well, you'll see the first thing I have here, no more cables. Woohoo! Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, in general, it's a good thing, right? Because you don't have the actual, cables themselves, which means now it's going to end up being easier to install. It also allows you to connect your networks through walls and other obstacles that maybe you can't get cables through. It allows you to quickly give temporary access to users who may be visiting your location. And then you'll see down here at the bottom I have equally secure, or maybe I should say equally secure? I have question marks there. And that's kind of the big issue, and as I mentioned a moment ago, we will talk about this in this video, how we can secure the data. So before we get to talking about securing data and all that fun stuff, let's first take a look at some of the details behind, just kind of setting up a wireless network. And the first thing you need to know, or the main thing really that you need to know about is, your wireless access points. Because without them, we don't really have wireless networking. So there's a number of different components that I have listed here, and it'd be a good idea that you are generally familiar with these particular terms. The first one I have listed here is BSS, which stands for Basic Service Set. Now this term is actually a pretty simple one. It just means that you have a wireless network with one wireless access point. Okay, so in your smaller environments, maybe a home network, small office network, you're going to be utilizing a basic service set. Whereas ESS, you'll see here, is the extended service set. And you could probably guess if the definition of basic service set is a wireless network with one access point, then the extended service set is, more than one access point being used together to create a larger wireless network. Now, in general, I'll tell you what, whether it be your basic service set or whether it be your extended service set, either way, the term really that you should be familiar with is just the understanding that this wireless network is being referred to as a service set. And the reason why is because this third item here, probably the most important one to be familiar with out of this entire group, is the SSID, which is your service set identifier. And your SSID, or service set identifier, is just that. It's the identifier of your wireless network, or the identifier of your wireless access point. Now the ESSID is the extended service set identifier, and quite frankly, it means the exact same thing as the service set identifier, but when you're using multiple access points. Okay, so just like your basic service set is one and extended is more than one, your SSID is with one access point, and ESSID is when you have multiple access points. Now, this next one, BSSID, Basic Service Set Identifier, this is the one many people get confused. And the reason why is if you just start using logic, you have your basic service set, your extended service set. Well, now we have our basic service set identifier and extended service set identifier. But if you just start using logic, you have your basic service set, your extended service set. Well, now we have our basic service set, your extended service set. Well, now we have our basic service set, your extended service set. Well, now we have our basic service set identifier and extended service set. But they don't actually mean the same thing at all. Okay, your basic service set identifier is the MAC address of your wireless access point. Okay, so please understand that the BSSID represents the MAC address, or that's an identifier of one specific access point's physical hardware address, versus the SSID is the actual name of the network. Now the last term I have here is BSA, which stands for Basic Service Area. And the basic service area is just that, meaning what area of space is this particular access point going to service. And that is something that we'll talk a little bit more about when we talk about the placement of your wireless access point, because the placement has a lot to do with, well, what area do you need wireless coverage? All right, well, speaking of where to place your wireless access point, it's really important that you get it right. I've walked into many companies where you kind of go in and scratch your head and you say, I don't get why when I'm over here, I can access the wireless network, but when I'm over here, which is kind of the same working area, just a slightly different location, I can't, right? How many times do you get that where employees are complaining, well, I get it good over here, but not so good over here? Well, lots of times that can be resolved by just knowing the appropriate placement of your wireless access point. Now, there are many different factors which will help you to determine where to place your access point. And one, well, we're just talking about that. Where are the wireless clients located? Okay, I mean, that's probably the number one question. Where are your clients located? Because we need to get our access point close enough to them to be able to connect to the network. But along those same lines, how far can the wireless access point send and receive its signals? Okay, so not only do we want to have it in proximity with the users who need it, but along those same lines, well, how far away from those users can we get? And again, continuing on that same theme, are you using what's called a directional antenna? Some of your wireless access points will have directional antennas to where instead of having a round service area, in other words, instead of the wireless access point being in the dead center of a circle, which makes up the service area, well, you can send the signal out in one direction, which will help it to go further distances in that direction and shorter distances in the opposite direction. Matter of fact, we can even get antennas that can help us to truly shape the basic service area. You can shape it to where it can go X number of feet out in one direction and a shorter amount in a different direction and a longer amount in a different direction. We can actually do that. So that's another thing we need to keep in mind. And then kind of the opposite of what we were just talking about is, well, although we may be thinking about where users do need wireless access, we may also want to be thinking about if there's anywhere we want to prevent from having access to the wireless signal, right? And if you're doing this at a company location, do you want the signal to go out into the parking lot out front, which means somebody could just drive up and grab hold of that signal outside your building? Maybe not. So these are the types of things that you need to take into consideration when deciding where to place your wireless access point. Now, the other thing I will mention along the same lines as all of this is you may determine that you need more than one wireless access point. Again, have walked into many companies where I ask, well, why is it that the wireless signal is strong over here and it's weak over here? And they'll say, well, because that's where our wireless access point is. And I'll say, well, why don't you move the wireless access point? And they'll say, well, we tried that. We moved it to a central location, and then that didn't work out either because neither of the two ends of our building could get it. Well, sometimes you just need to determine that you need two wireless access points in order to service your entire wireless area. All right, so let's take a look at some of our wireless networking standards. Now, I have a list here on the screen which shows 4 different standards, and these are the 4 most common standards that are out there. Although I will tell you that by today's standards, these bottom two, 802.11g and 802.11n, are really the only two that are being used anymore. Every rare once in a while, you might still come across somebody using 802.11b, and I'd be really shocked if you'd ever find anybody still using 802.11a. Now, let's take a look at some of the specifics that go along with these, because you're going to need to know these. 802.11a uses the 5 gigahertz frequency, can handle data rates up to 54 megabits per second, and that right there, if I kind of pause right there with data rate up to 54 megabits per second, there's two things I want to tell you there. One, on this entire page, anywhere that you see data rates up to a certain speed, you need to really keep that in mind. The data rate is up to that speed. That would be in an optimal situation. If you had a wireless client maybe 1 foot away from a wireless access point and they were the only ones connected and there was no other overhead to get in the way, then you would get your full data rate. But your actual throughput might end up being less than that. Matter of fact, it most often will be less than that if you were to truly gauge how much data you were going to be able to communicate back and forth. But the second thing I want to tell you about 802.11a, because you might be thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute, why do you say no one would use it anymore? I mean, if it's got data rates up to 54 megabits per second, which is comparable with 802.11g and better than 802.11b, why don't they use it? Well, the reason is because it ranges less than 100 feet and it's very easily obstructed. And then to go a step further, that 54 megabits per second, well, it drops dramatically as you extend out toward that 100 feet. Matter of fact, depending on exactly where you look up this specification, I mean, there's many different books, websites, etc., you might even get slightly different answers. I've seen people who have said that it ranges up to a maximum of 60 feet or 75 feet. Some say no more than about 40 feet, because once you get above 40 feet, you lose so much of that data rate, it's just not usable. So you really don't get much distance at all out of 802.11a. Now, 802.11b was one of the first wireless networking standards to really become popular. It uses the 2.4 gigahertz frequency, which, by the way, happens to be the same as things like baby monitors and other wireless devices. And so one negative that I'll tell you right away with 802.11b that I don't have listed here is sometimes you'll get interference between those other wireless devices, because the 2.4 gigahertz frequency is very, very popular. Wireless telephones, let's see, at my house I can tell you I have a wireless surveillance camera system, and whenever I had the cameras activated and then I tried using my laptop with a wireless network card close to those cameras, I ended up having a lot of difficulties. So the 2.4 gigahertz frequency is very popular, very heavily used, so you got to keep that in mind. But outside of that, you got data rates up to 11 megabits per second, which was not necessarily that fast for true wireless networking, but was considered plenty acceptable because most people were using it for the purposes of getting out on the internet, for internet browsing on a wireless network. And most internet connections did not exceed 11 megabits per second anyway, so it was considered to be very acceptable, especially in a home network. The other nice thing about 802.11b, using the 2.4 gigahertz frequency, is it can range up to 300 feet. Now, I have here listed outdoors versus only 100 feet indoors. And the reason I say outdoors versus indoors is, well, what's the difference? Yeah, we have walls in between. If you're in your house or you're in your office, there's generally going to be some kind of an obstruction. There's going to be a wall, or maybe the wireless access point is up in a drop ceiling, and now you have the actual drop ceiling in the way. There's a number of different factors and things that will get in the way when you're indoors. But guess what? You can still get 100 feet even through those walls. And I will tell you firsthand that I've done exactly that. I had my wireless access point. Now, I don't have this anymore, but my old 802.11b access point, I used to have in the furthest corner in my basement, and I live in a 2-story home, and I was able to use my laptop in my bedroom, which was in the opposite corner up on the second floor. And one day, just out of curiosity, I went ahead and I kind of did a drawing of the layout of my house and mathematically calculated how far I was away from the access point. And, well, it really wasn't quite 100 feet, but it was about 75 to 80 feet. And it worked just fine. And sometimes I even got the full 11 megabits per second. But I will tell you that once you start getting to the outer edges of the range, you do lose that data rate. And sometimes I would connect and it would only give me half of that. It would give me 5.5 megabits per second, or 3, or 1. So it did vary, but it can go 100 feet, and that's why it was considered to be so acceptable. Now, the reason we don't see a lot of 802.11b anymore is because it was replaced with 802.11g. And I will tell you that 802.11g is fully backward compatible to 802.11b, which is why a lot of devices, you'll see them rated as 802.11b/g. It'll use either one. So that's one really nice thing, because backward compatibility meant that you could upgrade some of your components to 802.11g without having to upgrade everything. Or for instance, at my house, I first upgraded my wireless access point to 802.11g, but all of my wireless devices, my laptop and other computers that were using wireless network cards, well, they still had 802.11b network cards. And, I just didn't feel like spending the money to buy all new network cards when things were working just fine. As a matter of fact, now that I think about it, one of my computers that I let my son use, and all he uses it for is internet, he still has an 802.11b wireless network card. Now, besides the fact that it was backward compatible, because it used the same 2.4 gigahertz frequency, it now offered data rates up to 54 megabits per second, and again had the same kind of range, 300 feet outdoors and 100 feet indoors, just like the 802.11b. So you could see why 802.11g is what is so heavily used. Now, the latest and greatest networking standard that's out there is 802.11n. And 802.11n is an interesting technology because, first of all, it can have separate channels using both the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz frequencies. It gives data rates, well, I have here up to 100 megabits per second, but the reality is that in a perfect scenario with 802.11n, if you have everything set up perfectly and you minimize your interference, you minimize your distance, you have all your channels available, that theoretically, I've seen data rates proposed anyway. I've not actually seen this in person, but I've seen it proposed up to as high as 600 megabits per second. So 802.11n can really provide a lot of throughput based upon these really high data rates. Now, the other really nice thing about 802.11n, check this one out, it can have a range up to 1,000 feet. Although I will tell you, once again, once you start getting past 100 feet, 200 feet, especially 300 feet, you're going to really start to see a deterioration of the maximum data rate. Now, if you're wondering how it is that somehow magically we wave our magic wand and we have a new technology and it gets a faster data rate, well, 802.11n uses something called MIMO, okay, which is M-I-M-O. MIMO stands for multiple in, multiple out. Okay, and basically it's the concept of using multiplexing. In other words, sending more than one signal at a time. And so that's why we can basically, because we have more than one, or even if we just said two, out and in at a time, well, we take our 54 megabits per second we had before, and we could essentially double it, right? And that would bring us up to 100 megabits per second. And then again, with multiple channels, MIMO working, everything in place, that's why theoretically they say we can possibly someday get all the way up to 600 megabits per second with 802.11n. So those are the four main wireless networking standards that you should be familiar with. Now, there's one last piece that you need to know, and that is the channels that are used. Now, 802.11b and G, they use channels 1 through 11. And then over here, you'll notice that I have listed as center frequency. Now, the reason I say center frequency is because there's a frequency range that each channel uses. And I will tell you that that range is approximately 30 megahertz. So what that means is, if right here for channel 1 we have 2412, what that means is you're going to get all the way down at 2397 on the low end and 2427 on the high end. Now you'll notice if this goes all the way up to 2427, well, doesn't that kind of overlap with channel 2 and channel 3 and channel 4? Yeah, it does. So the way this actually works is if you have more than one access point, then what you want to do is have one of them on channel 1, one of them on channel 6, and one of them on channel 11 to avoid the overlap and therefore avoiding any interference. Now, 802.11a had a set of channels that it would use, and you'll see here they are 36 through 64. And here we have set frequencies in the 5 megahertz range. Now, you don't necessarily need to be very familiar with these channels, but I will tell you that when it comes to the 802.11b and G, you do want to keep that in mind, that if you're using multiple access points and they need to work together, you want to make sure that channels 1, 6, and 11 are used so as to avoid interference with each other. All right, now that we've got all that under our belts, we need to talk about how to secure the data, right? Because you can set this up all you want, but you need to know how to secure the data in order to be comfortable in using wireless networks. Now, a couple of real simple things that you can do to secure your wireless network are to do what's called disable the SSID broadcast. Okay, see, basically, wireless access points, right, they all have the SSID, the service set identifier, and that identifier can be sent out as part of a beacon. Okay, the wireless access point will send out a beacon saying, hey, I'm here, and my name is. Okay, well, if an attacker sees that name, right, someone just happens to be there, and let's say it's not even an attacker. Let's say it's just typically somebody who didn't come there with the intent of breaking in, but they have a laptop with them with a wireless network card in it, and they turn it on, and suddenly it says, beep, 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 look at that. There's a wireless network here. Well, then they might get curious, and they might try to break in. Whereas if attackers don't see the presence of that wireless access point, if they don't see that there's a wireless network there, then they might think that there's nothing to attack. Now, I will tell you, before we go any further, that this is an amazingly minimal piece of security we're talking about here. If somebody truly wants to hack into your network, they're going to be able to locate your wireless network even if you're not broadcasting the SSID. There are tons of free tools out there that can locate a hidden wireless network in no time flat. But disabling the SSID broadcast is a great way to keep the honest people honest. Now, another real basic thing we can do is something called MAC filtering. And this is where you can specify what computers can connect to your wireless access point based upon their MAC address. Or we could say the MAC address of the wireless network card that they're trying to connect with. Okay, so again, this is something very basic that you can do. I can tell you that it can end up being quite time consuming, especially if you have a lot of legitimate wireless network users, because now you have to keep a manual list of all the MAC addresses of those network cards. Plus, again, if an attacker wants to get in, it is amazingly simple to go ahead and detect one of the other clients who are legitimately getting in, find out what their MAC address is, and then do what's called spoof that MAC address, to where you basically emulate that MAC address on your own network card. You can change the MAC address on your wireless network access cards without any real difficulty. So again, this is a very basic way to keep honest people honest. Now, if we want to talk a little bit deeper into security, we have something called WEP, which stands for Wired Equivalency Privacy. And a lot of people these days kind of laugh when they hear that, and the reason why is because they know that WEP is an older technology that once again can be easily hacked. See, the idea behind WEP was that it would make wireless transmissions as secure as wired transmissions, thus the name wired equivalency. But again, it ended up being easily hacked, and the reason why is because WEP was designed before we had all this major hacking going on. Okay, so this was used in the early stages of wireless networking. The good news with WEP is that it's amazingly easy to configure. Okay, if you want to implement WEP, it's really, really easy to do. On your wireless access point, you basically just say, I want to use WEP, and then you put in a secret password, so to speak, and you're on your way. What it does is it provides encryption for the data that's being transmitted over the wireless network. Originally, it was using a 40-bit encryption key, but then advanced to using 128-bit encryption. But again, it was found to be very easily cracked. Even the 128-bit encryption can be easily cracked. You go out onto the internet, you go ahead and do a Google search on how to crack WEP, and you will find all kinds of free tools that will come your way. So what we needed to do was move on to something a little bit better. And what that something was is something called WPA, which stands for Wi-Fi Protected Access. This was designed as an upgrade or an improvement to WEP. Now, one of the improvements that were made, because we still do encryption and all that, but one of the improvements that it made was that it uses TKIP, which happens to stand for Temporal Key Integrity Protocol. I didn't even write that on there because I don't know that you really need to know what it stands for, but you do need to know those letters because you'll see them come up. TKIP is something that uses a hashing algorithm to scramble the encryption keys. And what's really kind of cool is here's something that WPA does. It works a lot like today's garage door openers work, or like keyless entry to your automobile works. And what I mean by that is, it used to be easy with keyless entry to a car, right? You go ahead and you press the button and the doors unlock. Well, someone who wanted to steal your car, what they would do is they would hide out in some nearby location with some kind of a receiver which would pick up the signal that you were transmitting, and then they would just go ahead and create their own transmitter which would emulate that signal. And guess what? Next time you walk away from your car, they walk up with their transmitter and they unlock the doors to your car. Well, that's how it used to be. Now, today's keyless entry, what happens is every time you push the button to unlock the doors on your car, what happens is both the transmitter and the receiver both apply an algorithm which changes the code for the next time around. So that way, if somebody ever grabs your code, well, they won't have it the next time around because that code didn't work anymore. It only works once. Same thing with today's garage door openers, and guess what? Same thing with WPA. Now, even if somebody does hack in and figure out one of your codes, well, by the time they figure it out, that code has changed. Now, another thing that WPA does is it uses something called the Extensible Authentication Protocol, or EAP, which is something that is based off public key encryption technology, which utilizes certificates and private and public keys and all kinds of fun stuff like that, which we're not really going to get into right now. It's not a big concern right now, but I will tell you that it is something that is way more secure when it comes to verifying authorized network users, making sure that the appropriate user is connecting, not just the appropriate machine. So WPA, and I will tell you there's now WPA2, are quite secure for your wireless networks. Although I will tell you that when you set up WPA, you need to put what's called a passphrase, and that passphrase can be hacked. And so what you want to do is make sure that that phrase is, just like with your passwords on any computer, make sure that it's very long, make sure it has numbers and letters and possibly symbols, and make it as complicated as you can. And that way, if somebody's trying to do some kind of a brute force attack and just keep trying every single passphrase until they figure it out, well, it'll take them a very long time. If you use a long enough passphrase, it might take them, more years than a lifetime. Or if you're concerned about that, change it every once in a while, just like you do with changing your password on your computer. Now, if WPA is not secure enough for you, if you really need to know that you have absolute lockdown on your wireless network, you can use what's called 802.1x. Now, 802.1x is not exclusively for wireless networks. You can use it for access to your network of any kind. But 802.1x, because it utilizes certificates and radius, makes it near impossible to hack into. Nothing, of course, is completely impossible, but it's as secure as you're going to get. Now, certificates are used to provide a higher level of authentication of the user and or computer that are trying to connect. Okay? And certificates allow for things like smart card readers. Okay? Maybe you want to only let people connect to your wireless network if they have a smart card. So now somebody would not only have to figure out passphrases and stuff like that, but they'd have to have the physical card to go along with it. But we can also utilize radius, and a radius server is something that is used to centralize all connection requests within, well, here I have the wireless network, but that's just because we're talking about wireless. Radius in general would centralize connection requests to any network that was utilizing radius. Okay, and this radius server will have complete management and control over who can connect, when they can connect, how they connect. The radius server can also keep an account of who's connected and for how long. So if you ever want to go back and take a look at the logs and have very detailed logs, radius can do that as well. So 802.1x, I will tell you, very detailed setup is required, and there's a lot of cost involved. But if you have a wireless network that's going to have confidential information that really needs to be secure, then that's the way to go. All right, so now that we've talked about wireless networking and the different standards and wireless access points, where to put them, how to secure them, well, why don't we go ahead and take a look at one? So here in my office, I have a wireless access point set up. Now, the way you access this wireless access point, and quite frankly, the way you access most of your wireless access points these days, is through a web browser. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and click Start, and then select Internet Explorer. And then in my Internet Explorer, I need to type in the IP address of my wireless access point. Now, this IP address will be given to you in the owner's manual when you purchase the access point. There's one that's built in by default. Now, this particular one I have already set up and I've changed, and it's set up to 192.168.10.200. So let me go ahead and enter that. Oh, and one thing I want to tell you, you might also be thinking, well, if the wireless isn't, if we're going in to set it up, so it's not actually set up yet, how do I get to it? Well, the first time you connect to this access point, you're going to have an actual cable. There will always be at least one Ethernet cable port where you can plug in so that you can connect and configure all your wireless networking. All right, now that I've put in my IP address, it's prompting me for username and password. So I'll go ahead and type in the username and password for this particular access point. And I'll go ahead and click OK. And here you'll see it takes me into the setup configuration utility for, now in this case, I'm using a Linksys Wireless G broadband router. And I will tell you that this is probably one of the most heavily used wireless broadband routers out there today. Although I will say that wireless N is quickly taken over. But this is the typical type of broadband router that you will find in many homes and small businesses where there's either cable modem or DSL lines coming in, and you then want to share that connection with wireless users in that network. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the basics that we have here. Now on this first screen, I will tell you that this right here where it says automatic configuration DHCP, this is how the external side of this particular router is going to go ahead and get its IP address. Okay, so this doesn't necessarily have to do with the wireless aspect as much as just the router aspect of it, but many of your wireless access points are also routers. So what this is saying is I'm going to get my IP address to be able to connect to the outside world from a DHCP server. And I have a DHCP server on my network, which is going to go ahead and give me my IP address. But then if I scroll down, you will see here is where I can enter in a local IP address. Here's that 192.168.10.200 that I just entered to connect to this in the first place. Matter of fact, you can still see it up here in the address bar. That is not the default IP address. The one that it comes with by default will be given to you in your owner's manual, and I strongly recommend that you change it. And the reason you want to change it is because you don't want to let a potential attacker who knows the default settings of this particular router to be able to go ahead and get in easily. So here is where you enter your local IP address and subnet mask as it'll be recognized to the wireless network. Now here we see DHCP server again. And this is where I can either enable or disable, and what I'm doing is I'm enabling basic DHCP services on this wireless access point to my wireless clients. Okay? Now I give it a starting IP address and a range. You can also enter some DNS servers that you want to give out to the clients, just like you can do with DHCP. And I really don't want you to worry about this right now. I just wanted to show you because it is on the screen, and it's the first screen that you'll see on almost any wireless access point. And so I wanted you to kind of understand it and what its purpose is. But none of this really has to do too much with the wireless network. Now if we scroll back up, you'll see here's your wireless tab. If I click on that, let's take a look at some of these settings. Now first it says wireless network mode, and it says mixed. That's because this particular router, even though it's called a wireless G broadband router, as I mentioned to you earlier, G is very typically backward compatible to B, and if I wanted this router to work as a 802.11b router, well, then I would set it up to B only. If I wanted it to only work with 802.11g, then I'd say G only. But I went ahead and I said mixed because that way, whether I have an 802.11b or G client, they both would be able to connect. Now, the next line here is the name of the wireless network, or the SSID. And in this case, you'll see I've named it Ed's office. Okay, and that's because this is the wireless access point in my office. So that way, when other co-workers have their laptops and they're trying to connect to the wireless network, they can know, oh, hey, this is the wireless access point in Ed's office, so I need to ask him if I can connect to it. Now from there, you'll see here's the wireless channel, and again, you can choose anywhere from 1 to 11. And typically by default, if you're just using 1, you go ahead and use channel 6. And then here is that SSID broadcast. Okay, that beacon that I was talking about before that sends out a signal saying, hey, I'm a wireless access point, I'm here. You can choose whether you want that to happen or if you want to disable that, and then that way people won't see the Ed's office network. They'll be able to connect to it if they know it's there, but only by typing it in manually. They won't be able to see it otherwise. Okay, and then basically just down here is where we can go ahead and save our settings. Now if I go over here to wireless security, you'll see here that you can use different security modes. Okay, we can either disable security altogether, and that generally is not a good idea these days. Or as you can see here, we can set up WEP, and then you go ahead and put in some kind of a passphrase, which would then create an encryption key. Or we can go here to many different versions of WPA. We can use WPA Personal or WPA Enterprise. which basically has to do with the details behind what type of a network you're working in, how elaborate the network is going to be. And basically, I'll tell you that if you were to use WPA Enterprise, well, then you're saying that you are looking to work more in an 802.1x type environment. Okay, so typically in your smaller environments where you're just going to use WPA or WPA2, then you'll go ahead and select personal. Then here we can talk about the WPA algorithms, where here you see your TKIP, and then here you put in your WPA shared key or your passphrase that you want to use. And again, typically you want to use something that is lengthy and complex. And then how often you want the key to renew itself. So that's how you can set up your wireless security. Now another thing we can do is go over here to our wireless MAC filter, and right now it's disabled. If I wanted to enable MAC filtering, then I could go ahead and check it out. I can either allow all wireless network cards to connect except for the ones that I specifically lock out, or I could allow nobody in except for who I explicitly say yes to. Okay, and those are the two choices here. Here you can say prevent PCs listed from accessing wireless. Okay, so that's where you're allowing everybody except for who you list. Or permit only PCs listed to access the wireless network. So it's kind of whether you want to make it a blacklist or a whitelist. Okay, but in my case, I want to go ahead and just leave it disabled. I'm not using MAC filtering here at all. So that is pretty much how you set up your wireless access point. Now I know that there are a lot of other settings here, but remember that this is more than just an access point. This is a wireless router as well. So there's a lot of routing functionality that we have built into this. Okay, but typically all you need to do is right under your basic setup, you want to go ahead and decide whether you're going to hand out IP addresses to your wireless clients. And then under wireless, you determine whether you want to use, in this case, whether you're using B or G, or if this was an N router. I can tell you that I have an N router here where I could choose between B, G, or N. You give your SSID, you pick a channel, you decide whether you want to broadcast or not. You can set up if you want to use some form of security, and you can do MAC filtering. And that's how you would set up a wireless access point. Now once you have this set up, connecting to it is really the best way to verify that things are working right. You know, I mean, you just kind of, you go ahead and you take a client, you say, all right, can I connect into it? Hey, it works. But some of the things you want to watch for is if you have your SSID broadcast disabled, well, then you want to go ahead and open up a wireless client. And if you see your SSID out there, well, then you know that something's not working right. Okay, so it's more than just connecting. You want to make sure that things are set up right. Or let's say you have security set up. If you have security enabled and then you have a wireless client who just gets right in, doesn't get prompted for a passphrase or anything like that, well, again, something must not be done right. But I will tell you that connecting to a wireless network these days is amazingly simple, and just about every single operating system out there has a built-in mechanism for detecting and connecting to wireless networks. I mean, it's almost an automatic. If you've ever taken a laptop and, let's say, gone into a hotspot, right? A public place, a restaurant, an airport, a hotel, you know, somebody that's offering wireless internet services, well, usually there's not much you have to do. Typically, your computer will automatically detect that that network's there. It will connect to it, and you just open up your internet browser and boom. Other than going through a couple of maybe verifications with the particular company, or maybe sometimes going through a license agreement and things like that, you're on the network. So that's how you set up a wireless access point. And that brings us to the end of this video, and at this point, you should now be able to explain the benefits of using wireless networking. And of course, what's the number one benefit? That's right, no more cables. Woohoo! And I'll tell you what, if you've ever run cable through a building, especially if you ever try doing it at home, right? It's your home. And if it's a finished home, the walls are already done, and then you got to bust holes in them and run cable. Oh, it's not fun. So wireless is very cool that way. You should be able to describe the components of your wireless access point. You should be able to describe the different wireless networking standards. And again, remember, 802.11g and 802.11n are the two primary standards that you will find out there today. You should know how to secure your wireless network, and keep in mind that there are some easy ways to do it, but then those easy ways to secure it are also easily hacked into. And then there are some more sophisticated ways, but they are more time consuming and cost more. But they would truly secure your wireless network. And then finally, you should know how to install a wireless access point. So that's it. That's wireless networking. Why don't you go ahead and take a break, and I'll see you in the next video.